So what I'm going to talk about is, or what me and Martin are going to talk about then, and this is the title of the book, but also the real core, I think, of Nietzsche's theory and work, and his last work, which was put together after his death. So it was never a book that was completely finished by Nietzsche, is the idea of the will to power. Now, this is almost the fundamental idea, not only of Nietzsche's philosophy, but also, as Martin mentioned, the philosophy of a lot of people who in the traditional have taken over, moved on, taken Nietzsche's ideas, Foucault being one of those people in particular. Will to Power is the title of a collection of papers that was turned into a book after Nietzsche's death. And it really, all of his other ideas and other books, and other writings, which are quite difficult to make sense of when you first start reading them, really are fragments of this idea about will to power. Now, I'm going to hand over to Martin in a minute, but one of the reasons that Nietzsche is particularly, I think, interesting, not just because of his position and his prominence in European philosophy, but particularly interesting to social work, is he discusses, and his main idea is to do with something we talk about and we should be continuously conscious of in social work, which is power and the use of power, the nature of power. How does power work, not just on a systemic level, an institutional level, or structural level, which is where we usually think about it, but actually on a personal, emotional, and individual level. And the absence of Nietzsche from social work discussion, given how influential his ideas of power are, I think is a major gap that we have identified. So, Martin, I'm going to flip the slides over and hand over to you.
Yeah, so really, what I guess as a continuation from what Michael was saying is that what one of the fundamental theories and principles for Nietzsche's idea of power, and also really given the fact that Nietzsche is a non-voice in social work, certainly in the UK, it is how we link Nietzsche's concept of power to social work. So Nietzsche is a non-power voice in social work in the UK. And really what we're trying in our thinking is how we certainly in social, we talk about power, we talk about students, for example, and students not having power, how we manage power. And we do talk quite a lot in social work and in mainstream social about power. But the questions that Nietzsche asks us about power is what is power? Who has power? And how do we manage power on one level in a traditional way or a mainstream way, but also looking at what Nietzsche says, coming back to the words of Nietzsche and how he asks us questions about power. And that links in terms of things, how anti-oppressive practice, how that links to power. So rather than simply saying, using phrases like traditional mainstream phrases like anti-oppressive practice, anti-discriminatory, how are these words relevant or applied within the Nietzschean voice, Nietzschean notions of power, and the challenges in his complexity of power, and the will. The will to power and how that means, and that all that links really to people like, and Michael mentioned, Foucault, Bourdieu, types of sociology, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and decolonization. And really, what Foucault offers is a way of asking questions, looking at these terms critically, and that's the sort of area for us we think Foucault can offer us. He can offer us a different voice, different way of saying things, and at times a harsh criticality, which actually can help us wake up from traditional social work, wake up question the kind of traditional words the way he uses, like anti-oppressive practice and so on, and asks us questions about what these actually mean and what does it mean in terms of contemporary social work.
Great.
Am I moving?
I will move it on. Don't worry, Martin.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the things, though, is with, as you've said, there is this non-engagement with Nietzsche. And, right, let's look it on. And there are some very good reasons for that, or very understandable reasons for that, which are what some of the things that people struggle with Nietzsche about continuously. One of the big things that it struggled with and makes Nietzsche quite an unpalatable character, particularly for a profession like social work, is the associations with particularly Nazism, but also lots of different types of European fascism. Nietzsche, along with other cultural figures in Germany around the time, like Wagner, were really co-opted, and their ideas co-opted by the Nazi Party and the Nazi movement. And there were quite significant accusations after the Second World War that Nietzsche's philosophy was actually at its heart quite anti-Semitic. Now, this has become a lot more nuanced since that time, in that we have seen that there is a real misinterpretation of Nietzsche that has a melding or kind of reforming of his ideas, and the way that he spoke, which was in a very direct and sometimes quite dominating German fashion, that meant that his ideas could be changed, co-opted, moved, so that they could justify something that they weren't actually saying. We also know that a lot of his papers were reinterpreted from their original text or put back together again by people who did hold very anti-Semitic views, particularly family members, and I think it was his sister after his death, who was quite out and openly anti-Semitic. But there are that association with Nazism and fascism has really stayed in the public consciousness, even if it is something that really should be questioned about whether he would have had anything to do with that had he survived to see it. Probably he wouldn't. Certainly in my view, he wouldn't. The other issues with Nietzsche is that he talks about power in a very, as being something that is very uncomfortable for social workers to think of us having or us using. We always think of social work as being we are a quite powerful profession. We hold a quite powerful position in people's lives. We can demand to come into people's private spheres, demand to speak to their children alone. We actually are pivotal in one of the most intrusive things you can do in anybody's life, which is removing them from their parents permanently, and in the UK legally, or removing their children from them legally. So we are very powerful. But using that power, we like to think of ourselves being quite supportive, using it positively, using it in a way that makes people's lives better. Whereas Nietzsche talks about power being necessarily something that is malevolent. It is almost necessarily something that's used or brings out cruel intentions, cruel actions, and a malevolent will. He talks about power being something that's used primarily to dominate and to cause conflict, or as a tool in conflict, rather than to help and support. And this idea that as social workers are using this thing, and it can be very destructive and is likely to be used, if unchecked, very destructive, is a very uncomfortable thing for us to think about and to think of its implications. What if we think about how Nietzsche talks about power and the implications for social workers' motivations, for social work practice? It refocuses our ideas. For instance, if we think of ourselves as being helpers, or think of ourselves in a way that's usually referred to as a savior complex. In fact, Nietzsche would say, well, that's something that we are doing to other people, not necessarily for their benefit, but only for ours. That's a very difficult thing to think about. And it's very hard to see how Nietzsche's ideas fit with social work values and social work aims, because they are very hard and sometimes very critical of human behavior, human desires, human motivations, and the motivations of people like social workers who work for the state. So these are a number of reasons why it's quite easy to see why Nietzsche hasn't been really talked about in UK social work. We like to talk about theories that help us think of ourselves as helpers. We like to think about theories that point us to how to help. We like to think about theories that give us maybe if they don't do that, they give us a very neutral explanation about, well, this is just how a human being develops. Piaget is quite a good example of that, as is Erikson, as is attachment theory. Nietzsche doesn't do that. Nietzsche points the finger at human beings and says there are some darknesses there. And this is something I think that social work finds very difficult to engage with a lot of the time, particularly when we're engaging with it in a reflective way, saying, well, we might be doing this as well. We're quite good at pointing the finger out and saying, this is a problem. This institution is a problem. This way of doing things is a problem. It's very less comfortable and a lot less easy to point the finger at ourselves and to deal with that. But Nietzsche forces us to do that. And I think this is why Nietzsche really has not been discussed. But along with people like Marx, and this is why Nietzsche should be discussed, people like Marx, other people that Martin has mentioned, other people I've talked about, Nietzsche is probably at the pinnacle of influence on how power is thought about, how power dynamics are thought about, and how power is discussed. Almost all the theories that we talk about and use, like Foucault, who is discussed, although still peripherally in social work, like how we talk about domination of one people by another, oppression, how we understand that, how we understand discrimination, all really come from an idea of how human beings interact with each other and use power. And Nietzsche is almost, for European philosophy in any case, the foundation of how we thought about that. Another thing which Martin mentioned earlier is that even if explanations, and this is why we should think about Nietzsche, even if explanations of power are really difficult to think about, really unpalatable, in fact, maybe those are the ones we should be thinking about and discussing more, rather than the ones that we find easy to absorb, the ones that make us feel a bit better about our profession or what we're doing. And this is why we should discuss Nietzsche. Nietzsche can help us explain in a very different way how oppression works, why people do take malevolent actions against each other, why people are in the horrendous positions that sometimes they are, and we have a little explanation, or we can say it's because of poverty, it's because of whatever it might be, social condition, social class, because of them being excluded because they've been identified to be from a minority community, whether that's language, ethnicity, sexuality, anything like that. But that that explains why they might have been targeted for oppressive actions. It doesn't explain a deeper level of how that oppression works, how that power is used, and why it might be used, and how people can use it even not knowingly to oppress. It also provides, I think, if we think about Nietzsche and we think about ourselves as being people who aren't perfect, who are subject to this will to power, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later, it gives us a powerful way of thinking about how we should continuously reflect and check what we're doing. If a social worker believes, and I think from practice, I think this is a very important issue, if a social worker believes they're doing good, they will not check to see if they actually are doing good. If a social worker is conscious that they could do a lot of harm, they will be much more reflective, much more cautious in that use of power and in what they do with people. And I think Nietzsche provides us one of those voices, one of those ways of thinking that helps us to do that. I'm going to move on now to just having a look at some of, so I can explain, or we can get a clearer idea, or this is very complex, it's a very surface view of where the idea of the will to power in Nietzsche came from. and what it is. So Nietzsche started with his idea of the will to power as a critique of Darwin. Now, Darwin's ideas are very well accepted, which is the idea of natural selection, this kind of almost anonymous, continuous, slight change in physical attributes, or maybe mental attributes, that means that animals have a slight advantage in their environment. Those animals survive, the ones that didn't change don't. Now, two critiques that Nietzsche made of Darwin is, one, that this is not something anonymous, not something that animals have or people have that is out of their control. It's just absolute random chance. He said it's actually something, it's the will of that person or animal to survive. It's not the adaptation, it's their will and their desire to survive and to make sure they're the person who survives and the other one is the one that dies. So what what Nietzsche does in comparison to Darwin is, Darwin doesn't give any animal or any person any sense of agency. What happens to them is just pure random chance. Nietzsche says, in fact, agency is all. It's what that person decides to do, and they have the power to do that within themselves. So what Nietzsche says is, in fact, it's not these random selections and mutations. It's the desire and the will to take that power and to use it that means people and animals survive. So part of that is that the absolute core of anybody's drive, anybody's will to survive, is this will and this agency to take and to use power. That means that the natural or subconscious, unconscious drive of every animal, every person, is to have power and to use it to increase their position and their likelihood of survival, their likelihood to reproduce. So a big critic of Darwin, which was something I think me and Martin both were relatively surprised about when we started rereading Nietzsche, because neither of us knew that at the beginning, but it does make sense when it comes from here. Power and the will to power is the driving force of every action that anybody does. There is always a subconscious or conscious thought about how we're using, or how this, whatever we do, reflects on us and gives us power. So a lecturer who lectures, that in that lecture you're doing teaching, but there is another element to that, which is by lecturing, you're reinforcing your power position, your position in the hierarchy, whether it being a job hierarchy, the hierarchy in the PCF rainbow of where you are in as an advanced practitioner or above, your hierarchy with your students, your hierarchy in the university. All of these things, everything we do has that element to it. One of the big things that Nietzsche says is that power and this subconscious drive is by its nature almost completely unconscious. We can think about it sometimes, but it happens whether we're thinking about it or not. But it is also prone or almost always malevolent. And that means that it is always not just taking power from somewhere, somebody who's willing to give it, taking power from some source that we can all draw power from equally. It's about wresting power away from somebody else. So it's about enforcing a power position against or in competition with somebody else. So continuously, power is this struggle and this battle. And the malevolence is that you're taking power away. For Nietzsche, cooperation only occurs when it's based on self-interest. So this power, if we are doing things together, if we're cooperating, if we're working in a group or a team, the base or the foundational consideration of any individual doing that is this going to benefit me? And that's a very complex thing. People can do things that seem to be not benefiting them. For instance, dying for and the big example here is dying for a political cause, dying for some other cause, something like that. This is still based on self-interest, because it's still based on, for Nietzsche, the idea of how much power you have, not just as a living being, but also how much power you have after your death, how much power your ideas have, how much power your name has, your image has, which can go through. Now, This is where Nietzsche's ideas and Foucault's ideas interlink, which is that power is not linked just to, as we might think, physical power, but it is actually much more drawn in human society from your access to what is assumed to be the truth. So for Foucault, the idea is that the truth is completely intangible. Nobody actually knows what it is. So you gain power by convincing other people that you know more than them. You're more of an expert than they are. That gives you power. Because if somebody accepts that you know better than them, you can tell them what to do. And this idea comes from Nietzsche, that the power is intangible and it's exerted through social and intellectual interactions, much more than power is exerted through physical strength. And this means that we can come to positions, and this is important for social work, because social work is one of those professions where expertise is absolutely required. So we position ourselves as somebody who have more access to the truth of how children develop than maybe their parents do, than maybe a school does. And this gives us the power to be able to comment on that, to be able to assess that, to be able to advocate for a child to go on a child protection plan, to be able to go to court and advocate a child be removed from their parents. Now, I am running a little bit long, so I'm going to flip over here. One of the things that Nietzsche says as well, is that power is praxis. This means that power isn't something that we just hold and sit with. Power is something that only occurs when we're using it. And because we continuously are interested in power, we are continuously in all our actions exerting it. An example, which is quite a good one, is this particular conference that we're in now. I'm exerting power by giving this presentation, and I'm in the powerful position because you're all listening to it. This is how power works. I am at the moment in the powerful position. You're listening to my ideas rather than the other way around. Now, that's a very soft or mild version of power, but it is still the way that power works. And in social work, power, every action this means that a social worker does is an action of exerting power. It's based on our instinct to survive, which I've covered with Nietzsche's critique of Darwin. Use of power reflects, even when it's malevolent, even when it's harming others, how we know power is being used is because we have an emotional reaction to enjoying it. So we enjoy the use of power. It reinforces us. It reinforces every individual. It makes us feel better. It makes us feel more powerful, more safe, more happy, etc., etc. And if it's malevolent, it still does that. Power lost is quite traumatic. It's quite an uncomfortable thing to be. Being in a non-powerful position is very, very uncomfortable in that sense. There are two concepts I'm going to introduce now, and we will talk about why I'm introducing them. It will come clear slightly later, and it's more clear in the paper we will hopefully publish at some point, hopefully before 12 months has gone, which are these two positions that Nietzsche introduces. One is of the Übermensch, and this is the ultimately powerful person who is willing to take a risk to exert power, who doesn't know everything, but he's willing to fight, he's willing to exert power, he's willing to wrestle power from others. And this is an incredibly strong and almost the position that we should ultimately desire to be in, continuously using power, continuously focusing on ourselves and taking it for ourselves, and whether that harms others or not. Then there's the position of the Lichte Mensch. Now, Übermensch means overman, Lichte Mensch means last man. This is a person who knows everything and is not worried about it anymore. Somebody who's been rendered impotent by having or by thinking that they know everything, that everything there's too much knowledge, that they have no reason to fight, no reason to wrestle power because it's all been done. This is almost for social work, the idea of somebody who's been completely burnt out is a possible rough equivalent. So these are the two positions. Lichte Mensch is somebody who's completely unpowerful because they're not willing to wrestle, they're not willing to take the risks, they're not willing to wrestle power away from other people any longer. So this will is the big thing that changes them. The Übermensch will enjoy because they are having power and experiencing it. The least dementia will feel trauma because they have lost power. So what does this all mean for social work, or how can we apply some of these ideas? The first one is that we can use some of these ideas to realize that when social workers do things that are not perfect, that are difficult, that are in conflict with our service users, that are things where we might be using oppressive power, that we can check this by saying social workers are not perfect. They are human beings looking to survive like everyone else. So our natural desires here will be to wrestle power, will be to gain power, will be to do things that make us feel comfortable, that we know we have more knowledge, we have more expertise, and we can make sure that we can tell other people what they need to do. Risk aversity is exactly this kind of use of power. We have identified, because we are the experts, a risk to the child, and we are putting in a safety plan for them because we know what the risks are. This makes us feel safe. This makes us feel like the child is safe. This makes us feel safe in our profession, makes us feel powerful, makes us feel, etc., etc. That does not mean that it's necessarily in the best interest of that child. It's actually in our best interest. Now, that doesn't mean we should blame the social worker for doing that. And I think this is very important. And this is a very important implication from Nietzsche. This is a natural compunction and a natural thing for social workers to do, because it's a use of power to make ourselves feel more safe and better. But actually, we should reflect, are we using power for our benefit, potentially malevolently, or are we using power for the person's benefit that we should be, which is the child or the service user or the person on the receiving end? So this is a way that we can think, we can use Nietzsche's ideas of saying that power is always unconscious. We're always going to try and have this natural compunction to wrestle it. Should we be doing that? Have I done that here? And without thinking that we can do that, and we can do it very easily, and our natural drive is to do that, we might miss when we do this to people. And so this gives us a good way of thinking to reflect on our own actions and to check our use of power. Is it oppressive or not? And to be anti-oppressive. We must recognize as well as social workers that nothing we do is neutral. It always involves the use of power. Whenever we write a case note, how we write it, whenever we go on a home visit, how we do it, whenever we have a phone call with a parent, we are using our intellectual power, our power of expertise. For instance, I'll give you an example from my own practice. We can see that unannounced home visits for a child protection plan, why they should be done. But do I do them at a time when I think the child and the person are going to be in and they're going to be ready to welcome me in because they won't have something to do? Or am I going to do it at a time when I think they might not be in, or that they will be on the verge of doing something like going shopping, going to school, whatever it might be? I am, by using that slight change, I can use my power to intervene in their lives and to come round to their home to create a situation that's going to benefit how I want to write the case note, for instance. So I might if I visited at one point, I might get a very different reaction than if I visit another point. And if I have a very difficult parent or a very difficult case, I might want to visit, I might schedule my visit or have a natural compunction to visit at a time when I expect them not to be in. And I can then write a case not saying they're not in, I'm more concerned because I haven't seen the child. Now, that's not when I say an example from my own practice, I know that one of the things that I had to do was make sure that my unannounced visits were actually at a time when I was likely to catch the parent and the child in, and not in the middle of doing something like trying to put the child down to a nap or disturb this kind of thing. But that's a very specific example of how power can be used to create a completely different atmosphere for that child. And we must recognize that every small decision that we do, how we write a case note, the wording that we use, can say the same thing objectively, but it has completely different symbolism. This is everything that we do uses power, because this is Power is praxis. So every time we do something, power is there. We must also recognize that people will try naturally to wrestle power away from us. A father who is having their child, who has a child on a child protection plan, and he's quite domineering in their views, very clear and consistently narrow in their views of what should happen, that might challenge us, might demand to see us after 5 o'clock, that might refuse home visits and try and arrange them on their own terms, is not necessarily somebody who is being difficult with us. It's somebody who is engaged in a power relationship with us in which they will naturally see that either they gain power or we gain power. So it helps us to understand why difficult, challenging, non-engaging behavior might happen and how to potentially overcome it. So instead of saying this father is difficult, we'll say this father feels like, or is engaged in something that makes them feel incredibly unpowerful. We know that that's traumatic. We know that's uncomfortable. So if we continue to put them in that position, we are either going to dominate them and they give up and feel traumatic, or they're going to continue to fight to try and keep the power for them. So why would we do that? It gives us a different way of seeing why this might be happening, rather than they're just difficult and they don't care about their child. And finally, the natural use of power for Nietzsche sits completely in opposition to social values and ethics. And to overcome this, which is possibly something we'll look at more in our paper, it is something we're looking more at in our paper, is that we reject these two potential positions, which are the only two that Nietzsche gives us. The Übermensch or the Overmensch, the Overman, which is the person who has all the power and therefore feels good and feels in a powerful position, or the Letzter Mensch, the last man who has no power and feels traumatized. These aren't the only two positions. Potentially we need to have a different one. And the third position, a position that was rejected as impossible by Nietzsche, but I would disagree with, is of, and I've written it in German, a neutraler man, which is a neutral man. This means that social workers, to adopt this position, must be neutral to power. This is very hard or almost impossible to do with Nietzsche. So the implication is we must have the ability to understand how power works for us. Power is praxis. Power is our way to survive. We feel good when we have power. All of those things for social values need to be rejected or fought against. In fact, we need to feel less powerful, uncomfortable, give power away. This is the way that we can use Nietzsche to understand how, in fact, our natural compunction is to do one thing with power. To actually fulfill our values and ethics, maybe we need to do something very different. And that very different thing is going to be a difficult thing for us to do, because our natural compunction is to use power unconsciously to survive, to have a powerful position. Maybe we need to feel uncomfortable, and maybe we need to feel powerless to actually do social work as we think. Now I'm going to hand over to you, Martin, just for a last couple of thoughts.
Yeah, and I think just really to bring it to conclusion, obviously another way, because we talked about Foucault and obviously we talked about pre-Socratics, different ways of thinking, but obviously what Nietzsche can be seen obviously as a philosopher of suspicion. What he gives is not easy answers, positive ways of thinking. He's suspicious. Ultimately, he is suspicious of power in all its forms, suspicion of the church, religion, and so on. And that's perhaps one of the major things that, along with Foucault and Heidegger, Nietzsche brings that atmosphere, that focus on being suspicious, and actually also links, also in terms of social work, what Lord Laming said about the idea of suspicion. But obviously what Nietzsche means by suspicion, I suspect, isn't the same concept of Lord Laming, but it does bring us back to social work ideas and theories it brings us back in a way of looking at things in that suspicious sense, that a critically suspicious sense, that actually is one of the main, I guess, contributions of Nietzsche to human existence in contemporary social work and the world.
Right. And last but not least, if it ever gets published, this will be the paper, The Will to Powerlessness, which will expand on these themes. So thank you, everybody, for listening, watching, and that's us done. We have run over the time, I've noticed, by about 7 minutes. So I'm going to open up for questions, but only relatively briefly, I'm afraid. So are there any questions, comments? We do have a break schedule, which I'm sure everybody's quite interested in having. So, any questions, comments, hands up? You can just pop it in the chat or just say it.
Can I just say, for me, what's been really powerful is to actually talk about the subject of power, because I think that as social workers, we really do deny the amount of power that we have. So it's been really helpful and interesting to have that discussion and put on the table, and to, as you were saying, Michael, think about how do we look and explore, not deny our power, but look and explore, and how we can do what we do more transparently and more honestly. So I really appreciate that discussion.
Great. Thanks, Arlene. Aidan, you've got your hand up.
Apologies, I just came in very late, but it really resonates with Ireland at the moment. And we currently have a few safeguarding scandals, and social work is quickly scrambling to get power to protect people and forgetting about the person and the relationship. And it was, sorry, I was really late, but it really fits with sort of my philosophical views of social work needs to have less power. And it's lovely to hear that being said publicly, because in Ireland, I've been sort of kind of going, but we need to protect people. And I said, no, we don't. We need to empower people. So that's my observation.
Great. Thanks, Aidan. That's really good to know about that context as well, because we tend to be English social work, and I will say English, but it is different than Scottish. English and Welsh social work, I suppose, it can be very insular and not take into account what's happening in other places. Even very close, very similar kind of societies, cultures and things like that. So it's really good to hear. Thanks, Aidan. Any other questions or comments? Or we will have a very quick break and then go straight into Arlene and Paul, if that's okay.